So as we get started this morning, the question I have for you this week is a little different than the past few weeks. I've been asking you a lot about, worries and how much you worry and what do you worry about. I want to ask a different question today. Do you have anything good going on in your life? Did anything good happen this week? Did anything go well this week? And so my question is that if you have good things in your life, and I have good things in my life, and we all hopefully had at least one thing go well this week, how much time did I spend being consciously grateful for those things? I think being grateful is a big challenge for all of us. It's something that we can easily miss. Right, so today, as we wrap up the series we've been in for a few weeks, Worry, Weary, that's what I want to talk about, is this idea of gratitude, right? Because what has been our goal in this series, right? Our goal is to kind of understand our relationship with worry, but most importantly, try to worry less or learn that how we can worry less, right? And we've talked about a number of things throughout the series, right? In the first week, we kind of explored some stuff that the Apostle Paul was dealing with, and we saw some principles that he had applied in his life to address that. The second week, we actually looked at the sort of things that we often pursue, believing they will relieve us from worry that don't actually give us any relief. Last week, we looked at the things that we can pursue that do actually give us relief from worry. And I believe all those things are important. I mean, hopefully I do. If I bothered to take your time on a Sunday to talk about them, I believe all those things were important. But I believe today is the most important of all, that this idea of gratitude and being consciously grateful for things. I truly believe that gratitude is the most powerful tool we have against worry. Because we talked about briefly that what is worry, right? Worry in its simplest definition is anxiety about some future event. We're worried about what's going to happen tomorrow. We're anxious about a time frame we have no control over, or at least limited control over, and we're certainly not certain what's going to happen. Yet how much of our time is spent worrying about future events? And so I think one of the things that we find as we think about this idea of gratitude is it helps us to change our focus. It brings our focus into the present. What am I grateful for right now? It also, in a healthy way, has us look to the past. Right? We don't want to get caught up in the past, but it is useful to look at our past and say, hey, when did things go well? What good things do I have in my life now that I'm grateful for that came through my experiences and my journey in the past? And so gratitude takes our eyes off this uncertain future, and all future is uncertain, and puts us into something concrete, and something present, and something positive. So the Apostle Paul actually frames this idea. He talks about how this idea of being grateful affects our sense of worry, or in his case, he talks about it in terms of peace. Right? The Apostle Paul writes this: "Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God." He says, take what you're concerned about to God, talk to God about it, but do it with thanksgiving. Be sure to mention the things that you're grateful for. Be sure to talk to God about what you're grateful for. And he says, if we will do that, he goes on to say, then the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. What Paul is saying is that one of the most important ways to be free of worry, be free of anxiety, is to stay in connection with God, right? That's prayer. And while you're in prayer, to be thankful, right? To have gratitude. He says if we do this, we will have a peace that doesn't even make sense. That people can look at what's going on in our lives going, how are you not an absolute wreck over this? And you simply say, I'm okay. I have peace about it. Now, we might think that, sure, Paul probably wrote this when things were going really well in his life. First of all, if you've read the New Testament, Paul didn't have any times like that. Right? Paul was always dealing with some kind of issue. And it turns out when Paul wrote this, he was dealing with a very tense time in his life. He was dealing with significant hardship. If you remember when we launched the first week, when we talked about the Apostle Paul, Remember that he'd been on this long period of spreading the message of Jesus. He'd been traveling around the Mediterranean, and he'd actually made a lot of enemies along the way. Because when he would preach the message of Jesus, that would generally challenge the established power base, whether it was the Jewish power base or the pagan power base. And so he built up this really big list of enemies. And the city with some of his greatest number of enemies was Jerusalem. And in the first week, we looked at this time in Paul's life where he basically went to his friends and said, I feel that God is leading me to return to Jerusalem. And I don't believe it's going to be easy for me. In fact, I am certain I am going to experience hardship because of this journey, but I feel that that is what God is calling me to do. And if you remember, when Paul went out on that journey, he did experience hardship. Right? I mean, first of all, he actually had, as he got into the journey, he had at least one attempt made on his life. He then actually had to stand trial for multiple levels of government. And he just kind of he was kind of stuck in the system. He just had to keep going to trial. And kind of when he was in the area around Jerusalem, he ultimately got stuck in prison for a couple years, waiting for another trial. And finally, the decision is made that, well, you know what? You need to have your trial out in Rome, which is like 1,000 miles away. So we're going to put you on a ship with a centurion and some other prisoners. We're going to send you out that way. And he goes on this long journey, and then there's a bunch of difficulties. And as he gets further along in the journey, the ship hits a storm, a massive storm, a storm that goes on, we're told, for 2 weeks. To the point that they're throwing everything overboard, just trying to keep the ship afloat, until finally the ship is destroyed. And they have to swim to get to an island to survive. Paul gets to the island, and it seems like it's better, but then he gets bitten by a snake. And he has to hang out there for a few months. And then finally he gets to Rome. And he gets incarcerated again. But this time, where he was in a prison previously, this time he's under house arrest. Well, that seems better, except there's a problem. Paul doesn't have a house in Rome. So what Paul was required to do was find a home, rent it with his own money, buy all of his own food, while being under the guard of centurions. So he relied on his friends to help him with that. And he does this for 2 years. And it's during that 2-year window that he writes these words. All that he'd been through over the past 4, 5 years, he says, don't be anxious about anything, but with prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, take it to God, and you will have peace beyond understanding. And what's really kind of interesting is that Paul writes these words in a letter that he's sending to a church in a city called Philippi. And what he's doing is that in spite of his circumstances, he's actually writing them a letter to encourage them. To say, God is good. Great things exist. Here's how you can find peace. And he even writes them to thank them. He actually expresses gratitude to them for the support they've given him to allow him to support himself while he's here incarcerated, while they've supported him while he was out on his ministry. So in the midst of all that, somehow he has peace. He has gratitude. And he has the strength to share that with others. That's what he's doing when he writes this letter. Now, I believe this idea of daily gratitude is one of the best defenses we have against worry. Right? Because if we think about our lives, right, in any given day, in any given week, there are some good things, and there are some not as good things. Sometimes really difficult things. And if we're not careful, I know my natural tendency is to actually move very quickly past the good and focus on the bad. And I don't think I'm the only one who struggles with that. That somehow when things go well, I just go, well, that's good, boom, move on to the next thing. But when there's a problem, I can talk about it for hours. And gratitude starts to change that. Right? Because what ends up happening is that without gratitude, if our focus on our circumstances is always about the negative and the bad, well, when we look to a future which is always uncertain, at least in some degree, we're going to start to frame it from a negative viewpoint, because that's how we exercise our mind the most, on negative things. When we change our attitude to one of gratitude, we start to look to the future for gratitude, with gratitude, and to see possibilities with gratitude. So how do we actually kind of really incorporate gratitude into our lives? Well, I think one thing that we need to do, or that's helpful to do, is to actually have practices in our life that help us to remember the good, to actually capture things that we're grateful for. Right? One of the easy ways to do that is to make a good things list. When something good happens, write it down, and write them down all in the same place. So that way, when you actually are stressing out, you can go back and read through them. Right? When I first became a believer, I actually did that for years. Every time something good happens, I'd write it down, and I'd read through it periodically. Now, since then, I've evolved to journaling. I find journaling to be especially helpful, where you actually write out what you're thinking and what you're experiencing, and when you're worried, you write that out. When you're praying for something, you write that out. When something good happens, you write that out. Because when we write out all the things we're experiencing, we actually start to process them very differently. Our brains are actually wired so that when we write something out, we process it much more deeply than simply thinking about it or saying it. But maybe you're not really up for the whole journaling thing. So what would be another good way to capture it? Well, there's actually a kind of journal called a 5-year journal, which I was not aware existed until last year. Now, when Bonnie first told me she got me a 5-year journal, I'm like a really thick journal? Like what does that mean? Does anybody use a 5-year journal, out of curiosity? It's an interesting idea. What it is that each page of the journal has a month and a day on it. Like today is July 20th, right? So there's a page at the top that says July 20th. If I turn it to tomorrow, what do you think it says? July 21st. So what makes it special? Well, vertically on the page, there are segments by year. Right? So the one Bonnie gave me last year started with 2024. So on the July 20 page, there's a section at the top that's labeled, what do you think? 2024, right? Participation party, right? 2024. What do you think's underneath that? 25, 6, 7, and 8. Well, what happens? How do you use it? Well, when you start the first year on January 1st, 2024, you write out whatever it is. Now, it's small, so you want to be focused, right? Maybe things you're worried about, maybe things you're praying for, certainly the good things that happen. And as you go through the year, you go page by page in 2024. But when you get to 2025, what happens? Go back to the beginning, and before you write about 2025 on January 1st, you read what happened in 2024. And you go through that over and over again for 5 years. And what you start finding is that there were moments in your life where you felt like the whole thing was going to blow up. And you realize it's a year later, and I'm still here. And it's worked out. And I was so afraid about what was going to happen, and I was so worried about what was going to happen. Or maybe you're worried now, and you look back going, whoa, this great thing happened. I wasn't even thinking about that anymore. And over the course of 5 years, you begin to see God's work in your life in a really deep and substantial way. I really encourage you to consider getting them. You can actually get them that are predated by years, or kind of the least expensive ones, just leave the year blank, right? And you just kind of write it in yourself. You can kind of start whenever you're ready, and off you go. But it really is a way to kind of capture that. And to be honest with you guys, I did it for like the first 6 months, and I stopped. And so I'm fairly guilty about it. So basically, I'm confessing to you right now that here's this tool that I think is super useful. And I remember when I was working with it, how useful it was, because it forced me to be concise and really focus my thoughts. And so I think it's a really, really powerful tool. Now, these ideas of journaling and capturing, all super valuable. But I also think there's a more simple thing that we can do that we can start with. To every day have an explicit prayer of gratitude. So you start every day with a prayer of gratitude. And then the advanced version is start every day with a prayer of gratitude, and when you get to the end of the day, have another one. God, I'm so grateful for these things that happened today. I'm so grateful that you were with me through things today. Right? Because we tend to pray for the things that we want. We tend to pray for the things that we need. We start to pray for the things that we're worried about. And we should pray for all of those things. But we also want to be sure that we pray for those things that we are grateful for. Because we start to see God's presence with us. And we start to see that as we go through our lives, that God is always in it with us. And again, even in the bad things, you're still here. It didn't kill you. As scary as it seemed at the time. And that's not to say that your fear wasn't valid or legitimate. But it's that encouragement we need to go on, to recognize that God gives us so much. That we have so much in spite of our circumstances, that our gratitude and joy should not be driven by our current circumstances. A number of years ago, I was sitting in on a 12-step meeting, as I do from time to time. And this particular meeting was an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. It was a fairly large meeting, and different meetings have different structures, but a common part of any 12-step meeting is open sharing. You can kind of talk about what you're dealing with, what's on your mind, within the context of your recovery process. And on this particular meeting, the initial people that were sharing were people who were fairly early in the process. I mean, one person was kind of talking about the difficulties they were having with a job. Now, because of their drinking, they had lost their job, and they were trying to work their way back. And they're kind of just sharing the challenges they're experiencing there and what they're feeling. Another person was actually sharing the difficulties that they had in their family because of their drinking, they had actually created a lot of pain and destruction in their family, and they were trying to kind of earn those things back. Right? They were doing all those kind of things. More than one person was worried about an upcoming court date. You know, all those things were going on. And then it was interesting. It came around to one of the old-timers, and that's a positive term in this context. It's one of the old-timers. He was north of 70 years old. I don't know exactly how old he is. He had about 30 years sobriety. You know, and as all these kind of other folks were going on about all their difficulties and so forth, he just kind of, when it came his turn, he kind of left it silent for a second, and he said, you know what? I woke up this morning, and I hit my knees. And I thank God for all the things I have. I thank God for the fact that I slept under a roof last night. I thank God for the fact that I slept in a bed last night. I thank God for the fact that I have all the food I need for today. I thank God for the fact that I have a dog who loves me unconditionally. I thank God for the fact that I actually have the money to feed my dog. And he shared some of the other things he was thankful for. And then he said, after I finished praying, I got up, I fed my dog. And then I made my breakfast. And I had some extra time this morning, so I actually made myself a hot breakfast. And you know that truck of mine that had broken down? Well, I got it fixed yesterday. So me and my dog went hunting. And you know what? We didn't get anything. But it was a gorgeous day. And I was outside with my dog all day. Then I took my dog home and I went and met a friend for coffee, a friend who's in the program. And what he's saying, when he says that, is he's actually helping someone who's not as far along as he is in the program. He's discipling someone in a Christian sense. And he said, we had a great conversation. And then I get to come here tonight. And I could be here with all of you people. What a great day. I'm so blessed. There's the secrets, my friend. That is the secret. There is no secret, my friend. Right? That is the answer. This guy's life wasn't perfect. His drinking had cost him a lot. He had lost a lot because of his drinking. But he was not delusional. He knew he had those problems. But he knew that focusing on them wasn't going to change anything. Yes, if there's something you need to address, you address it. But our focus needs to be on gratitude, on what God has given us. Because how many of us, answer to yourself, would actually stop to think, God, thank you for allowing me to sleep indoors last night. Thank you that I had a bed. Thank you that I have food for today. And I'm not, it sounds like I'm trying to be negative. I'm not. I'm simply saying that, me included, we kind of get this baseline expectation of comfort. And it's all just a given. And none of it's a given. We're all blessed in the things that we have. So like this gentleman, I'm encouraging you to actually choose to be consciously grateful in prayer to God. Because here's what happens. When we are grateful, when we have gratitude, gratitude displaces worry. Right? Worry occupies a huge segment of our minds. I mean, just thinking to yourself for a second. In a given week, there are 160 hours in a week? No, there's more than that. 168. There's 168 hours in a week. Assuming that you get 8 hours sleep a night, right? That's minus 56, leaving 112 if I did that math right. Of the 112 conscious hours you have, how many of those hours were corrupted by worry? How many hours of your waking day does worry occupy your time? And how many of those hours were lit up by gratitude, even for a moment? Right? I'm simply encouraging us to consider what this means. And as I've said multiple times, because I want to really drive this home, even when things don't go the way you want them to, there's still something to be grateful for, because you make it to the other side, and you get to be here again, and you get to be part of this life. You know, I mean, there's this joke, I ask people this all the time, how are you doing today? And I'll get the answer like, well, I woke up on the right side of the grass. You know, and it's kind of funny and it's kind of true, you know. Right? That's something to be grateful for another day. You know, there's a psalm. It's probably one of the most famous psalms, right? Now, all a psalm is, just for context, a psalm is simply a song or a poem, right? So we have a whole book of psalms or songs or poems in the Bible, right? And Psalm 118 is one of the most famous psalms. It's credited to King David. And David writes this. He says, "This is the day which the Lord has made. Let's rejoice and be glad in it." In other words, let's take the time to be joyful for the day, to be glad for the day, to be happy about the things that are in it. Don't try to hide from it. Don't try to escape from it. Don't get swamped in worry. I mean, yeah, there are things going on in your life and you have to address them. But don't let them weigh you down. And then he says something that's kind of interesting. He doesn't just say be glad in it. He says do what? Rejoice. He says celebrate. Celebrate and be glad in it. You know, something that seems kind of interesting to me is that if you read through the New Testament, particularly the Gospels, we get the impression that celebrating was actually part of people's lives. That they were communal, and they would celebrate things together. In fact, the Jewish religion has a number of holidays that are really about celebrating. There actually is one particular holiday where you're encouraged to drink too much on that holiday. It's a very popular holiday, by the way. But that is actually true. There is one Jewish holiday where you're encouraged to actually imbibe a little too much. The question I have in my mind as I was kind of doing my research for this was that, is it possible that maybe the reason that we as a culture are more stressed, are more worried than generations before us, because maybe they used to celebrate together more? Right? How much time do we spend celebrating, right? You know, I find it interesting that celebration was so core to the first century audience that when Jesus was making one of his most important points, which is when he's describing to his audience that, hey, you guys think it's you think it's odd that I reach out and I try to speak to one person at a time and I try to change one life at a time? Jesus says, I want you to understand that, you know how much you guys rejoice? Well, when a new believer believes, the celebration in heaven between God and the angels dwarfs all that you are rejoicing. He says this in at least two cases. One is when he does the parable of the lost sheep. Remember, the parable of the lost sheep is basically, if you had 100 sheep and 99 were safe and one got away, you would go try to find that one. You'd leave the 99 to go find the one. And what does he say? Jesus goes on to say, and when you find it, you joyfully put it on your shoulders and go home. And then you call your friends and neighbors together and say, rejoice with me, I have found my lost sheep. I had 99 good ones, but I found one lost one. Rejoice with me, I found what I lost. They call their friends together. He makes that same point in a simpler example called the parable of the lost coin. That if a woman had a purse with multiple coins in it and she lost one of those coins, She would be more focused on the lost coin. And when she found the coin, what would she do? When she finds it, she calls her friends and her neighbors together and says, "Rejoice with me, I have found my lost coin." Now, it's interesting. If Jesus walked into us right now and said, "Hey, you know how much you rejoice when something good happens in your life? It's even bigger than that in heaven." What's your reference for that? What's my reference for that? How much rejoicing do we do in our lives? How much do we really celebrate the good things in our lives? Do we have people in our lives that we share our celebration with? Right? Because when he's talking to his audience, he's saying how you get together with your friends and rejoice. God and his angels are rejoicing. It's like that, but it's like what you do, but bigger. If I'm honest, he talking to me says, it's like what you don't do, but bigger. Because I don't celebrate the important things in my life, the good things in my life enough. My personality is, that one's done, let's go to the next one. And there's a lot of value to getting to the next one, but maybe stop for a second and enjoy it. I have a friend who works at a really large church down in Atlanta. So the fact that it's in Atlanta makes it a large church, but it's like tens of thousands. It's a huge church. And in one of their staff meetings, they actually had the youth leader there. That means that you're in a church with tens of thousands of people, and you're the person responsible for dealing with 8th graders. Yeah, exactly, right? They literally just stood up and applauded for him for 10 minutes. Says, what you do is that important. Take joy in that. It feels hard. You'll get lost in the hard. You get lost in the difficulty. Let's take this time to enjoy it. And that's the power of community as well, right? Is this idea that in our lives, we come together with people that we trust, and we share the good things in our lives, and we actually celebrate those with other people. But then we also get this kind of inertia that goes around, right? Because as we share what's good in our lives, and our friends celebrate with us, our friends then share what's good in their lives, and we celebrate with them. Right? What you do is you get this energy that starts to lift you up, starts to support you, starts to pull us all together. To recognize that in all the difficulty of life, and there is a great deal of difficulty in life, that you are not alone. That there's someone cheering for you, clapping for you, joyful for you for what's happening in your life. And there's also this incredible energy in being joyful for someone else, where we put aside this idea of pride and competition and jealousy. And instead, we just, you know what? That is a good thing in your life, and I want to celebrate that too. Because our lives start to become filled with more joy and more celebration. That is what displaces worry. Right? There's this kind of old saying, right, that nature abhors a vacuum. In other words, if you leave everything alone, something's going to move in. You know, Jesus even makes that point. In our case, if we're not careful, if we're not conscious, if we don't make an actual choice about what we want to occupy our minds, something's going to decide for us. And it's generally going to be the bad things, and the dark things, and the hard things, and the fear. So the biggest solution for worry is making gratitude a central part of your everyday. It's something that you consciously do. It is truly a transformative effort. If you do it, it will actually change the way you see the world. It will actually change the way you live your life. But it's not going to happen by accident. You have to choose it.